A routine patrol. The city of Glenhurst never really slept. The streets, dimly lit by the flickering glow of failing street lamps, carried the weight of whispers, sirens, and the occasional roar of an engine cutting through the still night air. Officer Randall Briggs sat in his patrol car, one hand lazily resting on the wheel, the other tapping against the grip of his sidearm. His shift had been uneventful so far. A stolen bike, a couple of drunks brawling outside a gas station, nothing serious. But there was always something. The radio crackled. Unit 14, report in. Any movement around Holloway Park? Briggs exhaled through his nose, pressing the radio button. Negative. All quiet. Except it wasn't. Briggs's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where he spotted a figure slipping through the park gates. It was after hours, and Holloway Park was supposed to be locked down at night, especially after the recent protests, the mayor's crackdown on unlawful gatherings, and the department's insistence on keeping order. But there she was, moving through the trees like she belonged there. Briggs narrowed his eyes. A black girl, maybe 16 or 17, wearing a hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers. Something about the way she carried herself sent a prickle up his spine. Not fear, but something close to defiance. He had been a cop long enough to know when someone thought they were above the rules. He flicked the lights on, a burst of red and blue illuminating the night for a brief moment before he killed them again. No need to make a scene. Not yet. Slamming the car into park, he swung the door open and stepped out. "Hey, you." The girl stopped but didn't turn immediately. She seemed to hesitate, then slowly pivoted on her heels, facing him like she had all the time in the world. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her tone, casual, unimpressed, set his teeth on edge. Briggs took a step closer, one hand resting on his belt near his holster. "You can't be here. Park's closed." She shrugged. "I live nearby." Briggs tilted his head, scanning her. The hoodie, the sneakers, the way she stood with her weight shifted slightly, like she was waiting for him to make a mistake. Something about it pissed him off. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Park's closed means you're trespassing." She sighed, glancing around as if the whole conversation bored her. "I'm just walking home. No harm, no foul. Right?" Briggs felt his jaw tighten. The way she was talking, like she wasn't afraid of him, rubbed him raw. He had seen this attitude before, and he never let it slide. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said, voice lowering. "Turn around. Hands where I can see them." Her eyes met his. No fear. Just something else. Disappointment. She sighed and reached into her pocket. Briggs didn't think. He didn't question. His training kicked in. Threat detected. Neutralize immediately. His gun was already in his hand before the thought fully formed. His fingers squeezed the trigger. The bullet tore through the air like a streak of lightning. It slammed into her chest. A gasp, sharp, choked, escaped her lips as she staggered backward, her legs giving out beneath her. Her body crumpled onto the cold pavement, arms sprawled out, eyes wide in shock and pain. Blood bubbled at the corners of her mouth, her breath hitching as she struggled to inhale. Briggs stood frozen, the gun still raised, the smoke curling from the barrel. For a second, the entire world around him disappeared. No more streetlights flickering overhead, no more distant hum of the city, no more sirens wailing in the background. Just him, and the girl, and the silence between them. Then from the corner of his eye, movement. Someone was running toward them, fast. Briggs's instincts screamed at him to raise his gun again, to take control of the situation, until he saw who it was. Mayor Charles Eaton. His face was twisted in horror, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And then he screamed, a sound that Briggs would never, ever forget. The world snapped back into motion. He had just shot the mayor's daughter, and his life would never be the same again. The fallout begins. The scream cut through the night like a blade, raw and guttural, sending a violent shudder through Officer Randall Briggs. It wasn't the kind of scream you could ignore. It wasn't the kind of scream you could forget. Briggs stood frozen, his gun still clutched in his shaking hand, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He had trained for this moment. He had gone through scenarios like this in drills, in practice sessions, in those endless police department meetings about use of force protocol. And yet, nothing had prepared him for the reality of it. The girl, Layla Eaton, lay sprawled on the pavement, blood seeping into the cracks of the sidewalk, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, hazy, confused, before slipping shut again. Then came the sound of footsteps pounding against the pavement. Briggs' mind screamed at him to move, to react, to take control of the situation. But his body refused to listen. His grip tightened around his gun as the shadowy figure rushed toward them. And then he saw who it was. Mayor Charles Eaton. His tailored suit flapped behind him as he ran, his face contorted with something beyond rage, beyond fear. It was pure, unfiltered terror. No. The mayor fell to his knees beside Layla, his hands pressing against her chest, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, baby, stay with me." Briggs took a step back. His mind raced for explanations, for justifications, for anything that would make this moment less of a nightmare. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. And then Eaton looked up at him. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, locked onto Briggs with an intensity that made the officer's stomach drop. There was no question in them. No what happened, or why did you do this? Only hatred. Briggs had spent 2 decades on the force, dealing with criminals, gangsters, liars, and lowlifes. But he had never seen a look like that before. Not from a mayor. Not from a father. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. And then Eaton spoke. "You just signed your death warrant, Briggs." The words were quiet, too quiet. Briggs stiffened. His training kicked back in, the ingrained instinct to take control of the situation, to follow protocol, to handle it. He reached for his radio, his voice steadier than he felt. "Officer involved shooting. Need paramedics at Holloway Park immediately. 1 injured." Eaton lunged. His hands, slick with his daughter's blood, slammed against Briggs' chest, shoving him backward. The officer stumbled, barely managing to keep his footing. "You son of a bitch," Eaton roared. "You shot my daughter. My daughter." Briggs' pulse spiked. He raised his hands, instinctively going into de-escalation mode. "Sir, back up. I need you to step away." "Or what?" Eaton spat. "You'll shoot me too." The words hit Briggs like a gut punch. The mayor was close now, close enough that Briggs could see the muscles in his jaw clenching, the veins in his neck bulging. For a split second, Briggs thought Eaton might actually kill him right there. Then the distant wail of sirens split the night. Eaton's face twitched. He exhaled sharply, as if regaining control of himself, and turned back to Layla. His hands trembled as he pressed down on her chest, his fingers sticky with blood. Briggs' mind raced. Think. There were no cameras, no body cams. It was dark. The only witness was him. Maybe he could fix this. Maybe he could say she. Then he saw it. A glow in the distance, a blinking red light. Someone was filming. Briggs' stomach dropped. His head snapped toward the tree line, where a shadowy figure stood, phone in hand, recording every single second of what had just happened. His breath caught in his throat. Oh God. He wasn't just screwed. He was done. The cover-up begins. The sirens grew louder, flashing blue and red lights washing over the scene as paramedics rushed toward Layla's body. The moment they arrived, Eaton moved aside just enough for them to work. Briggs backed up, watching them check her vitals, attach an oxygen mask, and press down harder on the wound. He swallowed. She was still alive. Barely. But if she survived, if she talked. No. Briggs' gaze snapped back to the figure near the trees. The phone was still up, still recording. "I need to stop this. Now." His fingers twitched toward his gun again. If he could just. "Don't you dare." Eaton's voice, razor-sharp, sliced through the chaos. Briggs froze. The mayor's glare burned into him, more lethal than any bullet. He knew. Eaton knew exactly what Briggs was thinking. The mayor took a step closer, lowering his voice to a deadly whisper. "You even try to take that phone, and I will bury you so deep, no one will ever find your body." Briggs' jaw clenched. His breath came fast and ragged. The phone. The video. The proof. It was over. Before he could move, police cars screeched to a halt, doors flying open as officers poured out, weapons drawn. For the first time in his entire career, Briggs found himself on the other side of the gun. "Drop your weapon. Hands in the air." Briggs' mind reeled. His own colleagues were pointing their guns at him. His fellow officers. The same department he had served for 20 years. Briggs turned slowly, his hands trembling as he lifted them. His gun hit the pavement with a metallic clink. From the crowd of cops, Sergeant Olivia Carter stepped forward. Her dark eyes burned into him with something close to satisfaction. Carter. She had never liked him, never trusted him. And now she had him. On the ground, Briggs. Her voice was cold. Now. Briggs barely had time to react before he was shoved forward, face hitting the rough pavement. The cuffs snapped around his wrists. Tight, too tight. The weight of the moment finally crushed him. He wasn't in control anymore. He was no longer the one giving orders. He was no longer the one calling the shots. His own department had just turned on him. And through the ringing in his ears, through the cold metal digging into his skin, through the sheer terror sinking into his gut, Briggs realized something. This wasn't the end of his nightmare. It was just the beginning. The beginning of the end. Randall Briggs had never felt fear like this before. Not in his 20 years on the force. Not during foot pursuits through dark alleys. Not during shootouts when bullets ripped through the air like angry wasps. Not even when he had been outnumbered and cornered by desperate criminals. No, this fear was different. This fear was cold. This fear crawled up his spine, wrapped around his throat, and whispered in his ear, "You're done." His face was pressed against the rough pavement, his cheek scraping against the cold, blood-streaked concrete. The cuffs bit into his wrists, too tight, deliberately so. Above him, Sergeant Olivia Carter stood like an executioner, her knee pressing into his back. "Officer Randall Briggs," she said, her voice hard as steel. "You are under arrest." Briggs' pulse thundered. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one standing tall, the one giving the orders, the one deciding who walked free and who got locked up. Not him. Not like this. He tried to lift his head, to make sense of the chaos around him. The flashing red and blue lights made the night feel surreal, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. A crowd had gathered at the edges of the park, civilians, onlookers. Some had their phones out, recording. Recording him. Every moment of his downfall was being documented. Briggs clenched his jaw. He wanted to shout, to tell them all they didn't know what really happened, that the girl, Leila Eaton, shouldn't have reached for her pocket, that he had reacted on instinct, on training. But deep down, some part of him knew that no one would care. Not about his excuses. Not this time. The weight of the moment. Briggs' world turned into a blur of movement. Someone grabbed his arms, yanking him to his feet. Pain exploded through his shoulders as Carter and another officer, Daniels, dragged him toward a squad car. His knees buckled. His ribs screamed in protest from where Eaton had shoved him. And the mayor. Briggs turned his head, his breath catching in his throat. Eaton was watching. Standing just outside the ambulance where paramedics worked frantically on his daughter, Charles Eaton looked like a man on the edge. His hands were still stained with Lila's blood, his suit rumpled, his tie loose around his neck. His expression was unreadable. But his eyes told Briggs everything. They were hollow, dark, filled with a quiet, simmering rage so deep it made Briggs' stomach churn. Briggs had seen that look before. Not on a politician. On a killer. Eaton wasn't just a grieving father. He was something else now. Something dangerous. The mayor took a slow step forward, then another. Carter stiffened beside Briggs. "Back up, Mayor," she warned. "We need to get him in the car." Eaton didn't blink, didn't acknowledge Carter. He stopped just in front of Briggs. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Briggs wanted to say something, to explain, to beg, but his mouth felt like sandpaper. Then Eaton exhaled, a slow, shaky breath. "You think the system is going to protect you," he murmured, his voice almost gentle. "But there's no coming back from this, Briggs." Briggs swallowed. "People like you," Eaton continued, tilting his head slightly, "always think they're untouchable, until they aren't." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You're going to rot." Then, without another word, Eaton stepped back, turning his back on him. Briggs barely had time to process it before Carter shoved him into the back of the squad car. The door slammed shut, and suddenly, the night outside felt like a different world. The drive to nowhere. Briggs' mind raced. This wasn't right. He should have been taken downtown. Instead, the car was moving away from the station, turning down unfamiliar streets. His heartbeat pounded. Something was wrong. The driver, Carter, kept her eyes on the road. Beside her, Daniel sat stiffly, gripping the wheel too tightly. Briggs cleared his throat. "Where the hell are we going?" Silence. Briggs' stomach knotted. "Carter," he tried again. "You can't just." "Shut up." Her voice was flat, emotionless. Briggs felt sweat bead at his temple. "I have rights." Carter let out a humorless laugh. "Did Layla Eaton?" Briggs had no response to that. The car turned again. This time, into an industrial area. Briggs' pulse skyrocketed. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. This isn't protocol. This isn't procedure. He wasn't being taken to the station. He was being taken somewhere off the books. Panic clawed at his throat. "Carter, this isn't how we do things. You can't." She cut the wheel hard, jerking the car to a stop in a deserted lot. Then she turned in her seat, looking at him with a cold expression. "You're right, Briggs." She leaned closer, her voice low. "This isn't how we do things, but it's how we're doing this." The back door opened, and Briggs found himself face to face with Marcus Greer. His blood ran cold. Greer was Eaton's fixer, a man who made problems disappear. The kind of man you never wanted to meet in the dark. Greer cracked his knuckles, smirking down at him. "Get out." Briggs' throat tightened. Oh, God. This was it. They weren't taking him to book him. They were taking him to bury him. The end of the road. Briggs' mind went into survival mode. Think. 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 He could fight. Run. Make a move before they. A fist slammed into his gut. Briggs doubled over, gasping, choking, reeling. Greer grabbed him by the collar, yanking him out of the car. The pavement hit his knees hard. His ribs screamed. Briggs groaned, trying to push himself up, but a boot crashed into his side. Pain exploded through his body. Greer knelt beside him, his voice a low growl. "You like shooting kids, huh?" Briggs coughed, struggling to breathe. This can't be happening. Another kick. Briggs' vision blurred. His body throbbed. His mind screamed. And then, gunfire. Loud, sharp. Briggs barely processed it. Something heavy hit the ground beside him. Another shot. Then, silence. Briggs' head lolled to the side. And there, standing over him, gun still raised, Sergeant Olivia Carter. Briggs' breath hitched. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Greer's dead body. Then she turned to Briggs, her face unreadable. "Get up." Briggs blinked. His mind reeled. What the hell just happened? Carter exhaled. "We need to move. Now." Briggs stared at her. She had just saved his life. But why? And more importantly, what the hell did she have planned next? No way out. The weight of a choice. Randall Briggs never thought he'd be on this side of a gun. His knees dug into the dirt, his ribs ached from the beating, and the blood in his mouth tasted like rust and regret. His wrists were still cuffed behind his back, the cold steel biting into his skin. And above him, standing in the dim glow of the streetlights, was Sergeant Olivia Carter. Her gun was still raised, the barrel aimed at the lifeless body of Marcus Greer, Mayor Eaton's personal enforcer. The same Marcus Greer who was supposed to make Briggs disappear. Now he was lying in a pool of his own blood. Briggs' breath came in ragged gasps. Carter just saved his life. But the way she was looking at him, expression unreadable, eyes dark with something he couldn't quite place, made it very clear she wasn't doing it out of kindness. She had a reason. She had a plan. Briggs swallowed hard, his voice rough. "Carter, what the hell did you just do?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she exhaled, the tension in her shoulders barely easing. "I gave you a chance," she finally said. "Don't make me regret it." Briggs' heart pounded. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Greer was dead. Daniels, the other officer in the car, was also dead, slumped against the driver's seat with a bullet hole in his head. Which meant two things. 1. Briggs wasn't dead yet. 2. Carter had just declared war on Eaton. And the mater did not lose. Buried truths. Carter knelt down and yanked the cuffs off his wrists, tossing them aside. Briggs winced as he flexed his fingers, his muscles screaming in protest. "Get up," she ordered. Briggs hesitated. "Why?" Her expression hardened. "Because if we stay here, we'll be dead in 5 minutes." Briggs swallowed his pride and pushed himself to his feet. Every inch of him ached, his ribs throbbing from Greer's earlier kicks. He spat blood onto the pavement and turned to face Carter. "What's the play here?" Carter didn't answer immediately. She walked over to Greer's body, crouched down, and searched his pockets. After a few seconds, she pulled out a phone. A burner. She stood up and held it in front of him. "Eaton's going to call this in soon. When Greer doesn't check back, he'll know something went wrong." Briggs frowned. "So what? We run." Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "You still don't get it, do you?" She took a step closer, her voice lowering. "There's nowhere to run. Eaton owns this city. He owns the cops, the judges, the press. The second your name hit the news, you stop being a cop. You're not just a fugitive, Briggs. You're a dead man walking." Briggs exhaled slowly. "So why help me?" Carter hesitated. Then finally, she said, "Because the system is rigged. And if it's going to fall apart, I want to be the one pulling the trigger." Briggs blinked. That wasn't what he expected. Not from Carter. She had always been the one who followed the rules. The one who never looked the other way, who never bent the law to fit her own agenda. And now she had just executed 2 men off the books. Carter tucked the burner phone into her pocket and looked back at Briggs. "We need to disappear. Now." Briggs shook his head. "Disappear where?" Her gaze was sharp. "We don't disappear." She paused. "We make Eaton wish he did." Briggs' stomach twisted. This wasn't survival. This was war. A city that never sleeps. Carter drove. Briggs sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the city blurred past. Somewhere out there, Layla Eaton was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. Somewhere out there, Eaton was getting the news that his enforcer was dead. And somewhere out there, people were waking up to a new reality, one where a cop had shot the mayor's daughter. Briggs rubbed his temples. His head was spinning. "Where are we going?" he asked. Carter kept her eyes on the road. We need someone who can get us leverage. Briggs frowned. Leverage against Eaton. She nodded. If we have something on him, something he can't bury, we can control the game. Briggs let out a bitter laugh. You think we can blackmail the mayor? Carter's grip on the wheel tightened. I think it's our only shot. Briggs exhaled. And where do we start? Carter's eyes flicked toward him. You ever hear the name Elijah Ward? Briggs frowned. The name was familiar. A fixer. Someone who used to clean up dirty cop messes before he vanished years ago. I thought he was dead. Carter smirked. So did Eaton. Briggs' pulse spiked. If Elijah Ward was still alive, they might have a chance. The man who knew everything. The safe house was deep in the city's underbelly. The kind of place where people went when they didn't want to be found. Carter led the way, knocking twice on an unmarked steel door. Silence. Then, a metallic click. The door swung open, and a man stepped into the dim light. Elijah Ward. His beard was grayer than Briggs remembered, his sharp eyes colder. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, sizing them up. Didn't think I'd ever see you two in the same room. Carter didn't waste time. We need information on Eaton. Ward raised an eyebrow. And why the hell would I help a disgraced cop who just put a bullet in the mayor's kid? Briggs tensed. Because if you don't, Eaton is going to bury all of us. Ward considered that. Then, after a moment, he smirked. Well then. He stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. Let's talk about burning the city down. The war begins. As Briggs stepped inside, a sick feeling settled in his gut. This wasn't about running anymore. This wasn't about covering up mistakes. This was about survival. Eaton was coming. And the only way out was through the fire. The ghost who knew too much. Elijah Ward was the kind of man you only heard about in whispers. Years ago, he had been a fixer, the guy dirty cops called when they needed a body to disappear, when they needed evidence buried so deep no one would ever find it. Then, just like that, he vanished. Some said he skipped town. Others said Eaton had him killed. But he was alive, and standing in front of them. Briggs and Carter stepped into the dimly lit room, the door slamming shut behind them. The safe house was nothing more than a one-room hideout, concrete walls, a flickering lamp, and a table covered in scattered documents, old police reports, and what looked like classified files. Ward studied them, his sharp, wolf-like eyes settling on Briggs. I'm surprised you came to me, Briggs. His voice was slow, measured. The last time I dealt with cops, they were trying to put me in the ground. Briggs swallowed the lump in his throat. We're not here as cops. Ward smirked. Yeah. Then what are you? Carter stepped forward, her arms crossed. We're people who need leverage, on Eaton. Ward let out a slow, dry chuckle. Oh, Eaton. Now you're speaking my language. Briggs clenched his fists. You've got something on him. Ward took his time moving to the table, flipping through one of the files. I don't just have something. He paused, tapping a finger against a faded document. I have everything. Briggs and Carter exchanged a look. Carter's voice was low. Then why the hell are you still alive? Ward looked up, a glint of amusement in his eyes. Because Eaton knows that if I go missing, every file in this room gets leaked to the press. Briggs' breath caught. Insurance. Ward had dirt on the mayor, so much that even a man as powerful as Charles Eaton couldn't touch him. But if Eaton knew Ward was still alive, that meant. Briggs' pulse spiked. Wait. His voice turned sharp. If Eaton knows you're alive, then that means. Ward's smirk vanished. A sharp knock echoed through the room. The air went ice cold. Briggs' stomach dropped. Carter's hand was already on her gun. Ward muttered under his breath. Shit. Another knock. Louder this time. Then, boom. The door exploded inward. Briggs barely had time to react before masked men flooded into the room, Guns raised, suppressors attached. Eaton had found them. The firefight. Briggs hit the ground. Bullets tore through the air, silenced but deadly. Sparks flew as rounds struck the concrete walls, splintering the old wooden furniture. Carter dived behind the table, yanking her gun free and firing off a shot. One of Eaton's men crumpled with a muffled grunt. Ward moved fast, too fast for an old ghost. He grabbed a Glock from under the table and emptied a full clip into the doorway. The masked men scattered, ducking for cover. Briggs, heart pounding, reached for the gun Carter had tossed him earlier. He barely had time to aim before another man lunged at him. Cracky! The impact sent them both crashing through the shelves, metal and paper scattering everywhere. Briggs grunted, grappling for control. The guy was strong. Stronger than Briggs had expected. The masked attacker pressed a knee into his ribs, trying to force the gun from his grip. Think fast. Briggs shifted his weight, rolled to the side, and slammed his elbow into the guy's throat. The man gagged, loosening his grip just enough. Briggs didn't hesitate. Bang! One shot. The guy went limp. Briggs gasped, chest heaving. The room was still shaking with gunfire. Carter was still firing. Ward had reloaded, and there were still two more attackers. One of them hurled a flashbang. Shit! Briggs barely had time to turn away before the explosion sent a deafening white light through the room. His vision blurred. His ears rang. Then, pain. A heavy boot slammed into his ribs, sending him sprawling. Briggs groaned, rolling onto his back. Above him, a figure loomed, one of Eaton's men, his silenced pistol aimed directly at Briggs' forehead. This was it. This was how it ended. Briggs braced himself for the shot. Bang! The masked man jerked violently. Blood sprayed. He collapsed. Behind him, Carter stood, smoke curling from her gun. Her face was set, cold, ruthless. "You're welcome," she muttered. Briggs let out a shaky breath. "Yeah, thanks." The last man standing turned to run. But Ward moved fast. Bang! The last bullet hit home. Then, silence. The fight was over. Briggs groaned, pushing himself up. The room was a wreck. Bullet holes in the walls, bodies on the floor, smoke hanging in the air like a thick fog. Ward reloaded his gun with shaking hands, muttering curses under his breath. Carter wiped the blood from her forehead. "We need to go. Now." Briggs, still catching his breath, ran a hand through his hair. "Eaton won't stop." Carter's gaze was sharp. "Then we don't stop either." Ward grabbed a flash drive from the pile of files. He tossed it to Carter. "Everything you need on Eaton is on there." Briggs' fingers curled into fists. This was it. This was their shot. Burn the mayor down, or die trying. The next move. They fled into the night, sirens wailing in the distance. They needed a plan. They needed a way to survive. And more than anything, they needed to make sure Eaton didn't. A city at war. Nowhere is safe. The city of Glenhurst was awake now. News of the shooting had already spread. The mayor's daughter, shot by a cop. Protests were forming in every borough. The streets were alive with anger, with grief, with something deeper, something ready to explode. Briggs, Carter, and Elijah Ward had barely escaped the firefight in the safe house, but they weren't out of danger yet. Not even close. The car screeched through the empty back streets of the industrial district. Ward at the wheel, Carter in the passenger seat, and Briggs slumped in the back, still catching his breath. His ribs throbbed. His hands were still shaking from the fight. His mind wouldn't stop racing. They had the flash drive. They had Eaton's secrets. And that meant only one thing. Eaton was coming. The secrets that could kill them. Ward drove in silence for a long time. The only sound was the distant hum of helicopters circling over the city, the occasional flicker of police sirens in the distance. Carter finally broke the tension. "What exactly is on that drive, Ward?" Ward didn't take his eyes off the road. Everything Eaton didn't want anyone to see. Carter frowned. Like? Ward smirked. Like proof that Eaton isn't just corrupt. He's a full-blown criminal. Briggs leaned forward. You're gonna have to be more specific. Ward exhaled through his nose. Eaton's not just running the city. He's running its entire underground. Human trafficking, drug rings, blackmail operations. Half the police force is on his payroll, and the other half is too scared to stop him. You think you were just another cop, Briggs? Briggs stiffened. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Ward glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Eaton had a plan for you. You were supposed to be the guy who pulled the trigger, sure. But then the cover-up. That's what he was waiting for. He wanted you to walk. To get away with it. He needed the city to be afraid. Briggs felt something cold settle in his chest. He had spent his career believing he was in control. That he was the law. That he made the decisions. Now, he realized he had been nothing more than a pawn. A disposable, replaceable pawn. And now that he wasn't useful anymore. Eaton wanted him dead. A city on fire. The news stations had taken over the airwaves. Carter turned the volume up on the radio as a frantic reporter's voice filled the car. Mass protests have erupted following the shooting of Layla Eaton, the daughter of Mayor Charles Eaton. The incident, captured on video, has sparked outrage across the city. Meanwhile, unconfirmed reports suggest that Officer Randall Briggs, the man responsible for the shooting, is now a fugitive after allegedly killing 2 officers and fleeing police custody. Briggs clenched his jaw. Carter exhaled sharply. Well, that didn't take long. Briggs felt his pulse hammer in his skull. He knew this was coming. Eaton controlled the media. The narrative. And now, the story wasn't about what really happened. The story was about him. About the dangerous, violent, rogue cop who had shot the mayor's daughter and then went on a killing spree. He felt sick. Ward shook his head. Eaton doesn't just want you dead, Briggs. He wants the whole city to want you dead. Briggs exhaled through his nose. So what the hell do we do now? Carter's grip tightened on the flash drive. We end this. Briggs looked at her. And how do you suggest we do that? Eaton owns everything. The courts, the media, the cops. Carter cut him off. Not all of them. Briggs narrowed his eyes. What are you saying? Carter glanced back at him. I know someone who's been waiting for a chance to take Eaton down. Briggs scoffed. You mean some idealistic rookie who's gonna get us killed? Carter smirked. Not exactly. She pulled out her phone, dialed a number. After 2 rings, someone picked up. A deep, gravelly voice filled the car. I was wondering when you'd call, Carter. Briggs stiffened. He knew that voice. Captain David Monroe. His old boss. The man who had taught him everything about being a cop. The man who had disappeared years ago after trying to expose corruption in the department. Briggs' mouth went dry. You're alive. He breathed. A chuckle came through the line. Yeah. And if you're calling me, that means you finally figured out what kind of monster Eaton really is. Carter cut in. We have a flash drive. It's got enough on it to burn Eaton's entire empire down. Monroe was silent for a long moment. Then, meet me at the old precinct. Midnight. Bring the drive. Then he hung up. Briggs exhaled. Jesus. Ward finally spoke. You really think this Monroe guy can help? Carter nodded. If anyone can take Eaton down, it's him. Briggs wasn't so sure. But it wasn't like they had any other options. The trap. They arrived at the old 9th precinct just before midnight. The building had been abandoned for years, left to rot after the city shut it down. Windows were shattered, graffiti covered the walls, and the parking lot was filled with debris. Briggs felt a knot tighten in his gut. Something felt wrong. Too quiet. Too empty. Carter parked the car. Ward checked his gun. Briggs clenched his fists. They stepped inside. The air was stale. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Briggs' pulse pounded as they moved down the empty hallway. A single door stood open at the end of the corridor. Monroe was inside, standing in the center of the old bullpen, hands in his coat pockets. Carter walked in first, Briggs and Ward close behind. Monroe turned to face them. "You have the drive." Carter pulled it out. "Right here." Monroe nodded. "Good." Then, from behind them, the sound of multiple guns cocking. Briggs froze. "Shit." Carter's eyes widened as masked men stepped out of the shadows, weapons drawn. Ward muttered under his breath, "This ain't good." Briggs turned slowly, and his heart stopped. Charles Eaton stood at the entrance, a smirk on his face. "Thank you for bringing me my property," he said, his voice like ice. Briggs' world tilted. It was a setup. Monroe, his old mentor, had sold them out. Carter's knuckles whitened around her gun. Ward let out a slow exhale. Briggs' mouth went dry. Eaton took a step forward, his smirk widening. "Now let's talk about how this ends. The reckoning. The setup." Randall Briggs had always thought he knew how the game worked. For years, he had played it, enforcing the law as he saw fit. He had believed in power, in control, in the authority of the badge. And now, here he was, disarmed, surrounded, outplayed. Standing in the dimly lit remains of the abandoned 9th Precinct, Briggs faced the reality that the game had always been rigged. Charles Eaton stood in front of him, smirking. The mayor's presence was suffocating. Dressed in a dark, pristine suit, he barely looked like a man whose daughter was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. If anything, he looked more dangerous than ever. Behind him, masked gunmen filled the room, their weapons trained on Briggs, Carter, and Ward. But the worst part, Captain David Monroe, the man Briggs had once trusted, the man who had disappeared after trying to expose corruption, was standing right beside Eaton, calm, his hands in his coat pockets, his face unreadable. Briggs' stomach twisted. "You sold us out." Monroe sighed. "It's not personal, Briggs. Like hell it isn't." Asterisk. Carter's hand twitched near her gun, but they were too outnumbered to make a move. Eaton took a slow step forward, tilting his head at Briggs like he was studying a dying animal. "I gave you an easy way out, you know." His voice was smooth, almost amused. "You could have just let the system bury this. You could have walked away." Briggs clenched his fists. "Walked away." He let out a bitter laugh. "You were going to kill me." Eaton's smirk widened. "Obviously." Briggs' pulse pounded in his ears. He needed a way out. He needed a plan. And then Eaton turned his gaze to Carter. "And you, Sergeant Carter." His smirk faltered for a second. "You disappointed me the most." Carter didn't flinch. "The feeling's mutual." Eaton clicked his tongue. "All those years following the rules, playing the good cop, and now you're standing beside a murderer." Briggs' jaw tightened. "I didn't." Eaton cut him off. "Oh, save it." He took another step forward, looking Briggs dead in the eye. "You shot my daughter." The words hit like a bullet. The entire room seemed to go silent. Briggs swallowed hard. He didn't have an excuse, because at the end of the day, Eaton was right. Briggs had pulled the trigger. Briggs had made the call. And now Layla Eaton was clinging to life because of him. Eaton exhaled slowly, the rage in his eyes barely controlled. "You don't deserve an easy death." He nodded to one of his men. "Take them outside." A dead man's walk. Briggs, Carter, and Ward were shoved forward at gunpoint. The night was cold, the distant sirens blending with the hum of the restless city. The streets were still alive with protests, the rage of a city that had been simmering for far too long. They were marched behind the precinct into a darkened alley, far enough from the street that no one would hear the gunshots. Briggs' breath came shallow. This was it. This was how it ended. One of Eaton's men pressed the barrel of a pistol to the back of Briggs' head. Ward exhaled through his nose. "This is one hell of a way to go." Carter glanced at Briggs. You got a plan, genius. Briggs didn't. But he needed one. Fast. Eaton stepped into the alley behind them, adjusting his cufflinks. You know, this isn't even about revenge anymore. He let out a slow breath. It's about balance. The city needs order. And if people think they can take shots at me or mine and get away with it, he shook his head. Then they'll start thinking they can burn the whole system down. He motioned lazily to his men. Make it clean. The sound of guns cocking filled the air. Briggs felt his pulse spike. Carter's jaw clenched. Ward muttered under his breath, "Damn shame." Then, a voice cut through the night. "Drop your weapons. Now." Chaos erupted. Spotlights flooded the alley, blinding them all as figures in tactical gear stormed in. SWAT. Briggs' heart leaped. Gunfire exploded around them. Eaton's men scattered, trying to return fire, but they were outgunned. Briggs took his chance. He lunged forward, twisting away from the gun at his head, grabbing the man's wrist and slamming him into the wall. Carter spun, disarmed one of the shooters, and took him down with a single shot. Ward just ducked and laughed. I love when plans come together. Briggs didn't have time to ask how the hell this was happening. The alley was chaos, bullets tearing through the air. Eaton's men fell one by one. Eaton himself. The mayor was already running. Briggs spotted him slipping through a side door, vanishing into the building. "I'll get him," Carter yelled. Briggs didn't hesitate. He ran after her. The final confrontation. Briggs sprinted through the corridors of the 9th Precinct, his breath ragged. Ahead of him, Eaton burst into an old office, slamming the door shut. Carter skidded to a stop beside Briggs. He's cornered. Briggs didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open. Eaton was standing near the desk, his gun raised. Briggs froze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eaton laughed. "You should have just stayed down, Briggs." Briggs took a slow step forward. "It's over, Eaton." Eaton shook his head. No. His grip tightened around the gun. Not yet. Then, bang. Briggs barely had time to react. The bullet grazed his shoulder. Carter fired back. 2 shots. Eaton staggered. He let out a slow breath. Looked down. Blood was spreading across his suit. For a second, he seemed almost amused. Then he collapsed. Briggs stood over him, breathing hard. Eaton choked, his hands pressed against the wound. His eyes locked onto Briggs. "You think this changes anything?" he rasped. Briggs exhaled. "Yeah, I do." Then Eaton's eyes went still. And just like that, the mayor of Glenhurst was dead. The aftermath. SWAT cleared the building. Eaton's men were either dead or arrested. The flash drive was handed over to the press. And within hours, the city burned. The truth came out. Eaton's empire crumbled. And Randall Briggs. He wasn't a hero. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't a villain either. Carter lit a cigarette, glancing at him. "So what now?" Briggs exhaled. The sirens blared in the distance. The city was still awake. And maybe, just maybe, this time, it could be saved.